Hello and welcome along to my Jesmond Dene video. In this video I'll be showing you how to make an abstract landscape using an old printed postcard picture of the mill at Jesmond Dene. If you're local to Newcastle you might be familiar with it. Very little of this actually remains now. If you go to the same spot you can still stand near the waterfall and look over the bridge, but there's only sort of the ruins of these buildings left and the wheel as well, the mill wheel, which is still there, but obviously not working, so it's a very different sort of scene these days. Before I start talking about the kit, I just thought I'd show you the original postcard. So this kit was inspired by a postcard I found at a local flea market, and it's just a lovely old image of the scene in Jesmond Dene. I had to sort of do a double take when I found it because I didn't realise at first that it was the ruined mill that stands there today. Unfortunately, this postcard's left blank on the back. Sometimes I find them and they've been sent to someone and the date stamped and I can figure out how old the card is. But for this one, I'm not sure, unfortunately, so I'd have to do a little bit more local sleuthing to put a date on it. But it's a lovely old image, which I've transferred onto printed cotton, which makes it stitchable, if you like, which I'll go through shortly when I start talking about the different steps you take to put this collage together. So thank you very much for purchasing this kit and coming along to watch the video. The idea is it's just a short video which sort of pairs up with the instructions, and you can go through this video at your own leisure. You can pause, stop, rewind whenever you need to, and I just sort of talk you through the process a little bit, show you some close-ups of the piece that I've made. My sort of instructions aren't really exhaustive. The idea is that you don't have to create something which is a carbon copy of what I've done, but you can learn the steps and you can learn my approach and then feel a bit more confident about creating your own. So let's get started. Okay, so in your kit you've got some basic materials, everything you need to make the collage. You should just have to add pins, needles, scissors, and an ironing board is also really useful to have. I'm actually working on my ironing board today, that's why you can see some little bondweb marks on it. I'm not very good at all at sort of keeping the iron, but for just clothes I end up also doing lots of arty bits and bobs on it as well. So in your kit you'll have a piece of bump and a piece of linen. The bump is just almost like it's a curtain lining, but it's almost like a felt. That would be something that's quite similar to it. And I just use it underneath a lot of my linen projects because I use a lot of vintage linens which are quite fine, and sort of have been washed and worn over time. So I like to put the linen over the bump when I start a project, and that just makes it sort of thicken up. It's a little bit stabilised, and when you sew it feels a little bit more substantial. So that's the first step. So you've got your linen placed over your bump. You'll also have a sheet of bondweb, which is iron-on glue, your printed photograph, some collage fabrics in different colours, some white machine thread, I'll explain that in just a moment, some buttons and some hand embroidery threads. Okay, so once you've got your linen over your bump, the next thing we need to do is work with the photograph to get it onto the base, and that forms the start of the collage that we build around the image. Excuse me. I'm just using the misprint today. You'll notice there's a white line through mine, but I'm just using the misprint because it just saves on a little bit of waste. This photo fabric's really good. I've tried lots of different brands over the years, so do get in touch if you'd like the link for it. It's a really lovely crisp image which doesn't rub away when you sew, and it can be sent through an inkjet printer at home. So you'll notice that's got a paper backing on it. The first thing you need to do is just peel that paper backing off, which comes away quite easily. You can discard that, and then if you lay that onto your ironing board face down, you next need to take the bondweb. Now the bondweb is a paper backed glue, so one side is paper, one side is slightly shiny. If I bring that into the light, you can just sort of see a ribbed pattern there as well. And what you need to do is pop the glue side down onto the back of your printed photograph, just like that. And then we're going to iron through the paper for a few seconds and secure that in place. So I'm just going to press it in place by ironing it for a few seconds with a hot dry iron, and then it's ready to use. Okay, so once you've got that bondweb ironed onto the back, you've got a nice paper backed photograph now. And what you can do now is, don't peel the paper off just yet. You can now trim that photograph down if you want to. You can cut it down to size a little bit, so you can sort of make it your own a little bit if you like. What I have done with this one, if I show you my sample here, is I've actually cut away the skyline, so I've just got the tree line in the top, and that just softened that straight edge. If you wanted to put trees in the background later on with collage, you could cut out the trees, so you just have perhaps this sort of stone edge here where you've got the waterfall and then you've got the mill houses and the bridge. Entirely up to you. But I'm just going to trim off the top now. And I'm just going to go along the tree line with some scissors. Again, If you keep the paper backing on, it makes it easier to cut. You get a nice sharp line because the bonder web on the back stops the fray. And it's sturdy, it sort of makes the photo fabric a little bit more stabilised with having that paper on the back, so it's just a bit less floppy and a little bit easier to cut, because sometimes fabric can be a little bit fiddly to cut really precisely. So I'm just quickly going to go along there now. So I've cut away the skyline, get rid of that. The next thing you can do is you can decide where you want to put it. Now, before you peel the paper backing off in just a moment, it's worth keeping the bottom of the postcard, because old postcards tend to be titled. And as I said before, I was working with a misprint on this one, so I've just already snipped off the bottom of this. But you can see on your printout, you'll have this white band along the bottom. If you cut that out and keep it, you almost have a title, which you can then use in your collage. So I used it in this one. Along the bottom it says, in Jesmond Dene, Newcastle upon Tyne. So you can stitch those lovely printed elements into part of your collage as well. So I'm going to snip that's snipped off and kept to one side. And then you can decide which way you want to go. Now, in my sample, I've actually worked this way, as you can see here. So I've gone landscape. Now, with other landscape samples that I've done before, I've gone portrait, and there's nothing stopping you from doing that as well. So if you preferred to work down the way and imagine bands of colour in the landscape working down, you could put the photograph there, and you could bring all of the greens down here, which suggest all of the wildflowers and plants that are in the foreground. But just going with my original sample, I'm going to turn it landscape, and I'm going to pop mine just in the middle and then build up the collage around the photograph. So in order to get that secured, all we do now is we just peel off this paper backing. You can hear it's worked because you can hear that sort of crackly noise when it comes away from the glue. You can discard that backing paper, and then if you just look in, if I show you in the light there, you can see that little the pattern of the glue has gone onto the back of the paper now, onto the back of the fabric, sorry. So that means that the glue is on the back of the printed photograph. You can pop it down in place wherever you want it. I'm going to put mine in the centre, and again, just 5-10 seconds, give it an iron, and that will bond nicely onto your backing cloth, ready for collage. If you've got scorch marks in the bottom of your iron, it might be worth putting a tea towel over the top, just to protect your iron plate or protect your work, but mine's pretty okay, so I'm just going to use that one there. So once you've got that photograph ironed down nicely, you can start the fun part. And so now we're going to start creating our textile collage using the scraps of fabric that are included in the kit. And it really is an imagined landscape almost. It's quite an abstract representation of a landscape. So I tend to work out from, in this case, because it's landscape, I tend to work out from the photograph. So you can see I've got greens creeping in at the side. I've got small bits of crochet to suggest things like trees and leaves. Greens creeping on this side as well. A little bit more prominent at the front, because what we're trying to do is give the idea of perspective. So there's a sort of like almost like little hillocks and banks where wildflowers might grow at the front, and then trying to sort of make the stitching a little bit less sort of dense towards the back to give a bit of an idea of distance. And then in the front here, because in front of by Jesmond Dene Mill you've got that waterfall, so you've got this big rocky outcrop here, I've used greys and beiges to just kind of try and extend that rocky outcrop a little bit into the foreground, and then sort of have the suggestion of greys, which might be stones, sort of a flatter area at the front here as well. Okay, so this is the fun part now. So you can just start selecting fabrics, you can start snipping, chopping, you're going to start collaging some of those fabrics around the edge, so they're just sort of feeding into the photograph a little bit. You might want to select a few colours to start off with. You could even add some of your own colours from your own fabric stash if you like, especially if you've got some nice textures and things that you wanted to use. Nice bit of crochet for this one. And you can see as well when I do this, I'm not sort of cutting a perfect shape to fit in a certain space. I'm really just, let me just get a little piece here. I'm really just using the back of the scissor blades, and I'm almost kind of making little snipping motions and hacking into the fabric and moving the scissors as I go, and creating like almost a serrated edge. And if you imagine that you're doing collage as if you're working with tissue paper, you tear papers to create texture. It's kind of like cutting in that sort of motion, so you can create little torn edges with fabrics. And decide where you want to start. I think when I did my first one, I started with the trees and just started layering bits in. And just, you can work from the edges outwards really, and just building it up slowly. You You can put little bits of crochet in to suggest trees. You don't have to cover every little bit. There's no sort of set way to doing this really. It's nice to have beiges at the bottoms because you can start to emulate those rocks that are there. There is a little bit of water coming under that bridge, so you might want to put some blue just at the bottom. And it's just about layering out little sort of slices, as if you've got torn, as I said before, as if you've got torn papers for collage. Just little slices, laying them all down. When you're happy with what you've got, you can pin them all in place. That makes the next step much easier. But it's just a question, it's just a sort of matter of enjoying it really, and faffing and playing and moving things around and changing your mind, and you know, there's no sort of set way to do things. And just building it up really slowly. It might look really messy at this point, but once you get the stitching in and you give it a good iron, it really comes into its own. So I'm just going to continue building this up now. So you can see those little slices start to come in from either side, and it just gently builds into a landscape that starts to suggest an extension of the photograph that you've got in front of you. I quite like these little edges here, so I'm going to use that frayed edge. Again, I'm just snipping and chopping. So now we have everything collaged down, and also I've pinned these in place. We can anchor them a little bit more with some stab stitch, which I'll show you in just a moment. But I just wanted to mention, if you find working with lots of little bits of fabrics quite fiddly, pinning them all, I have been told, I haven't tried it myself, but I have been told that if you use a glue stick like Pritt Stick and just put a little bit of Pritt Stick on and glue them in place, that can sometimes be a little bit easier to keep things in place than using pins if you find that everything's moving when you put pins in it. Another helpful tip as well is if you've laid everything out and then you want to pin it or glue it and you don't know if you're going to get everything back in the same spot, is just take a little photograph of it on your phone first of all, and then you've got something to refer back to when you're putting things back in place and pinning. So at the moment I've got everything pinned down. Now it can be really, really annoying when you're trying to do embroidery at the next stage if you've got all those pins in your work still, because as soon as you start sewing, you just get everything wrapped up in the pins and you end up poking pins in your fingers, and it's just not a pleasant experience at all. So in this kit there's a little bit of white machine thread, just normal polycotton machine thread, nice and fine so you don't see it when it's in your work, and I just use a really quick stab stitch, almost like a tacking stitch, just to get everything in place so I can get rid of all the pins, give it a quick iron, and then you can really see your work because it's not completely littered with pins. So to do a stab stitch, you just thread your needle with the white machine cotton. It's too thin to tie a knot in the back, so I tend to sew it into the back of the work. This is where the bump comes in nice and useful because it's quite thick, so it's nice to sew thread into that. So sew it into the back, push your needle through at the front, and then all you're going to do are really small stitches which just anchor those bits of collage in place. And it's called stab stitch. See, I've got myself wrapped around the first pin in the first stitch I've done. That's why we need to do stab stitch and get rid of the pins. So it's called stab stitch because you only see a tiny pin prick of a stitch, whereas a normal tacking stitch you'd have big sort of longer white stitches across your work. With this one you keep the long stitch on the reverse of the work and you do the smaller stitch on the front of your work, so you are always just popping the needle in very close to where you came from, and the stitches really just disappear into the fabric so you can't see them. So you don't always have to take this out afterwards as well, you can just leave that tack and stitch in. There, look, I've got hooked around another pin. So I'm going to just do one more in this bit of crochet, and then what you can do as you're doing this little stab stitch is as you go along you can happily get rid of those pins and you start to see your work a bit better again. So if you just stab stitch everything roughly around the edge, get rid of the pins, give it a quick iron if you want to, and then we're ready for some hand embroidery. Okay, so once you've got your pins out after you've stab stitched and you've given it a little line, you'll be ready to do the hand embroidery, which is the nice bit. So you've got 6 strands of embroidery cotton in this kit. There's about 1.5 meters, I think it is off the top of my head, of each one, and I would always cut those a bit shorter before you stitch with them. Any pieces of thread that are longer than the distance from your hand to your elbow are likely to end up in knots when you sew. So it's a good idea just to take a small snip a small piece off. And then I often sew with just 1 strand or 2 strands. And the temptation with six-stranded cotton, is to splay it out and pull it apart, and then you get that sort of twist that happens when you're trying to pull the pieces apart, and that can often lead to knots. So my little trick is to just splay those threads out. I'll try and do it over the white so you can see a little bit better. Splay those threads out on your fingers and just take 1 thread at a time and pull it straight and lay it out. And you can do that with as many strands as you want, but what happens is because you're pulling straight up or just straight out, you don't get that twist and you don't get any knots in your thread. And then you can just lay them out together, snip the top, and then you're ready to start stitching with just 1 or 2 strands, whatever it is that you need to do. Now I'm not going to go through all of the stitches because you want to be getting on with your own. What I am going to do though is just have a little chat about the stitches that I use. And there is a stitch guide in the back of the printed instructions as well if you did need any help or suggestions with different stitches to use. So I'm just going to bring this a little bit closer to the camera now. Now I'm a great believer that the most simple stitches are often the best, and if you just treat your stitches as if they were a pencil line and you were adding texture and shading and little marks to your embroidery, then you don't have to get too bogged down in technical and any complicated stitches. So you can see here for the sky I've got a little bit of running stitch, where I've got trees and I've got leaves that would have sort of been in all directions. I've got a bit of seed stitch, which is just running stitch, scattered in all directions. It gets its name from looking like a packet of seeds have been scattered down on the work. You can see here there's some longer stitches with just a single strand, and I've just done those almost like pencil marks, and I've kept these ones very sort of horizontal and vertical, and worked them also into the almost blended them a little bit into the printed area as well, and that's just to help to suggest that kind of, it's almost like a hexagonal pattern of flat stones that sit by the waterfall. There's a little bit of back stitch there just to highlight the bridge. More seed stitch over here. Occasionally there's some little vertical stitches just to join little bits up so that none of the fabric sort of flaps up and forwards. And there's just some really straightforward ones. Nothing's really technical at all. It's more about how they look en masse. I do like a French knot. That's really good for raising texture. So where you've got things like you know, trees, or you might have some flower heads. French knots are great for that. A little bit of French knot in there for the water as well, just to kind of try and bring that water feature into the fore a little bit. And then, as I mentioned earlier on with the sort of the bands of colour in the collage, equally with the stitch, I try and bring larger stitches to the front as I would bring larger bits of fabric to the front, to try and create the idea of perspective, so that you've got something in the background, you've got bigger things in the foreground, and it just gives an abstract landscape a little bit of a sense of perspective. So I'm quite a big fan in my landscapes of in the foreground, when I've done everything else, I kind of do all the seed stitches and whatnot first of all. The last thing I do is put these big long grasses in the front, and that really, I think, for me, helps to give the sense of perspective. So you've got something going on in the foreground, and it puts this bit in the background. So they're just really long stitches. And in some cases, a little bit of split stitch, but it's mostly just long stitches, 2 strands with a few French knots at the top, and really exaggerate them. They've almost come to the top of that collage, but again, that just gives a little bit of an idea of distance. And then on this side, same thing again. I've done a few little bullion knots there, but it's just long stitches to suggest grasses, and again, just some little V stitches here. You can do a fly stitch, or you can just do 2 stitches in a V shape, and that again just to suggest grass. And then I've put the title on from the original postcard in Jesmond Dene, Newcastle upon Tyne, just on there. I've also included buttons in your pack, so if you did want to add like a little button onto the corner of that, that's sometimes quite a nice little finishing touch. And then that's it really. It's, you know, it's all about exploring and enjoying adding the texture, keeping it simple, but when it builds up, it really starts to add some lovely texture to the landscape piece. So I hope you enjoy making it. If you've got any questions at all, please do just drop me an email. And I do always love to see the finished pieces as well, so if you did want to share your work, I'd really like to see that too. But I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you have a nice little summer of stitch.